Well, good morning, everyone. This is lovely to see everyone, a little masked, a little not. Well, welcome to what will be an important and informative discussion today. My name is John Johnson. I'm Senior Vice President in the Global Government Affairs team at Citi, a proud member of USGLC. USGLC is honored to host today's events with special guests Deputy Secretary McCune and Bonnie Glick. Unfortunately, Representative Castro will be unable to join us today as he's under the weather, but the show will go on. And we appreciate the opportunity to have this important conversation today with Deputy Secretary McCune and former Deputy Administrator Glick on efforts to strengthen and modernize U.S. foreign assistance and hear about new initiatives by the Biden administration to modernize the State Department and bipartisan areas of a consensus. In today's uncertain times, these issues certainly resonate, not just in Washington, but all across the country. And in addition to those of you who are in the room today, we are happy to be joined online by friends spread far and wide who all believe that America is at its best when it leads in the world. Business leaders, humanitarians, college presidents, and most recently, a cadre of mayors around the country have joined USGLC, along with members of Congress, to demonstrate what foreign aid is worth, and that is everything. Today, we will talk about the many global crises we are all facing, from COVID-19 to climate to famine to the invasion of Ukraine, and most importantly, how those critical investments that we make can be retooled to deliver more effective outcomes, saving more lives, keeping more people safe, and building a stronger economy. Over the years, USGLC has been a strong voice for modernization and reform, whether by advocating for fresh approaches or adapting our foreign assistance toolkit to meet new challenges. There is bipartisan support for reform on Capitol Hill and in the policy community, keeping with a robust legacy of bipartisan support for America's development and diplomacy programs. This is a particularly timely conversation today as the administration just rolled out its FY23 budget. We're in great hands with this conversation today with one of our country's most senior diplomats, and it is my honor to introduce him now. Brian McCune is the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources at the United States State Department. In this role, he is responsible for directing, coordinating, and supervising State Department operations such as foreign assistance and civilian response programs. He previously served in several national security positions in the Obama-Biden administration, including roles at the Department of Defense and the National Security Council. Deputy Secretary McCune also worked for more than 20 years in the U.S. Senate, including 12 years as chief counsel to the Democratic members of the Committee on Foreign Relations. Please welcome Deputy Secretary Brian McCune.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here. And hello to everybody who's virtual. I'm sorry we're not having Congressman Castro here for this conversation, so I hope he's feeling better soon. It's a really nice space. We don't have anything like this at the State Department. Those who lamented the construction of the Ronald Reagan building maybe have second thoughts a long time ago. It's really an honor to be here with Bonnie Glick, former Deputy Administrator of the Agency for International Development, not just because she's a seasoned professional, but also married to a former colleague of mine on the Foreign Relations Committee staff, Paul Foldy, who I think is here. Paul came to the Foreign Relations Committee to do a Pearson Fellowship for Senator Biden because he was from Delaware, liked it so much and liked not having the constraints of the State Department. Bureaucratic processes, he decided to make a second career on Capitol Hill and came back to the Hill and went to work for Senator Lugar. So it turned out, proved we didn't ask partisan questions of what party Pearson Fellows belonged to, and he went back to work for the Republican ranking member, chairman of the committee. It's great to be a guest of USGLC again. I did it last week in Miami, so I don't know where are we going next week, Michelle, on this road show. Hawaii is good, yeah. I was down there to do other things besides USGLC, including visiting some of our State Department field operations, going to some universities, but met with the local advisory council members in Miami, so that was a good conversation. I saw on the RCP list former Secretary Glickman. I don't see him here. Oh, there he is. So great to see you here, sir, and long and distinguished career in public service. Great to see that you're still in the arena. And I know you didn't go to the Kansas University, but you're probably still smiling this morning. Yeah. So hope I don't offend any Tar Heel fans. I was neutral, having gone to a university that went out in the second round. So USGLC is really a fantastic organization. It's really played a critical role in harnessing and mobilizing the constituency for funding diplomacy and development, including to help protect budgets for the State Department and USAID. When I came to Washington a long time ago in the mid-1980s and started working on these issues for then Senator Biden, the consensus was there wasn't really a constituency for the State Department and AID, and that the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill was carried across the finish line by support for the Camp David Accords and not much more. But the constituency was always there. It was just looking for some organizational and political smarts to figure out how to tap it. And a lot of credit goes to USGLC and its partners for doing that hard work over the last couple of decades. And I don't see Liz Schreier here, but she obviously is the brainchild behind the organization and the driving force behind it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work that we are doing to build on the foundation that many of you have helped to create through engagement with members of Congress on a bipartisan basis. Let me start with our budget. As President Biden often says, he likes to quote his father, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. And if you have our recently submitted budget for fiscal 23 nearby or in front of you, you would notice a few things. First, the President's request of $60.4 billion for state and USAID, that's not all of Function 150, just the two agencies, is the largest base budget ever requested for the two agencies, because the Biden-Harris administration values the role that these agencies play on the front lines of global challenges that shape Americans' lives and will for years to come. It's no accident that President Biden's first visit to a cabinet department was to the Department of State. He wanted to send the signal that in his administration, diplomacy will be at the center of our national security policy. It's also not an accident the President ensured that our USAID administrator would have a seat at the National Security Council table, because he wanted to ensure that the perspective of development and humanitarian assistance is fully integrated into our national security deliberations. Second, our FY23 budget seeks the resources necessary to deliver on our commitments to our allies and to protect and promote U.S. leadership to address the generational challenges and opportunities that we face. The President and the Secretary of State's priorities for such investments reflect a recognition that our work overseas should protect and accelerate Americans' prosperity and security at home. That's what we mean when we talk about foreign policy for the middle class. And it's one way we think about modernizing foreign assistance. It starts with stopping the spread of COVID-19 and strengthening global health security to prevent and mitigate future pandemics, because Americans will not be safe until everyone is safe. We're a little disappointed that Congress right now is working on supplemental funding for COVID-19 and there's not an international component to it. But we're not giving up, and we're heartened by some statements by some leaders in Congress that they want to keep working on it. We think it's critical that such funding be made available, because we cannot help put an end to the pandemic or prepare for the next one without sufficient resources for the international response. It also means U.S. leadership to address the climate crisis and to help American workers and businesses navigate the green energy transition. It means investing in multilateralism and working with partners and allies to counter the rise of authoritarianism, which fuels corruption and coercive practices. That's why last December, President Biden held the first of two summits for democracy in a shared effort to set forth an affirmative agenda for democratic renewal and to address the greatest threats faced by democracies today through collective action. At the summit, leaders from 100 governments announced a wide range of commitments and pledges to counter efforts to combat disinformation, strengthen electoral integrity, better promote the human rights of activists and marginalized populations, and close vulnerabilities exploited by corrupt actors, among other initiatives. It means using diplomacy and economic statecraft to promote a level playing field globally, strengthening the rules-based international order, which is an environment in which U.S. jobs, innovation, and competitiveness will thrive and facilitate our efforts to enable sustainable, inclusive growth. That is why the President sought to advance the global minimum tax to end the race to the bottom on corporate taxes at the expense of public revenue that we and our partners can use to make generational investments. It also requires protecting critical infrastructure, building supply chain resilience, and protecting and promoting U.S. leadership in cyberspace and emerging technologies. Just this week, the Secretary announced that we've stood up a new bureau in the State Department for cyberspace and digital policy, which has received bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. He's also announced, we haven't set it up yet, but we're going to have a special envoy for emerging technologies. Third, in our FY23 budget, we seek to continue to build on investments in the workforce at both the State Department and USAID to help us achieve these objectives. With the support from the Congress, we received healthy increases in fiscal 22 for staffing and training, and we're going to keep building on it to revitalize the national security workforce, which we've been charged to do by the President. One of my primary roles in this effort on behalf of Secretary Blinken is to lead implementation of his agenda to modernize American diplomacy, to ensure that the State Department is best positioned to meet the challenges of this century by creating an even stronger, more agile, more diverse institution equipped to lead America's engagement in the world. As Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources, with respect to the second prong of my title, I serve as Principal Advisor to the Secretary on use of all foreign assistance resources, including those managed by the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the Development Finance Corporation, and working closely with our USAID colleagues and our Director of Foreign Assistance, Dr. Daphne Rand, we seek to ensure that all of our efforts are harmonized with the President's strategic priorities. So that's a quick overview, and I really look forward to the conversation with Bonnie. I just noticed you have a Ukraine pin, and I forgot mine. So if you'd only told me, I would have brought my pin. No, that's fine.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary McCune. Before we begin our conversation, I'm happy to introduce the rest of our panelists today. First, I'm pleased to introduce Bonnie Glick, who served as Deputy Administrator of USAID under the Trump administration, championing digital transformation inside of the agency, as well as promoting increasing internet access bandwidth as a priority in emerging markets around the world. Bonnie previously served as a Foreign Service Officer for over a decade. Today, she serves as the inaugural director of the Craik Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. Moderating today's conversation will be Michelle Beckering, USGLC's Director of National Engagement. Michelle, Bonnie.
Great, thank you, Jayon, and thank you all for joining us today. It strikes me, this is one of our, at USGLC, one of our first really in-person events since COVID. I think we've only had maybe a handful of others. And so it feels very invigorating to be in this room with you and seeing a lot of familiar faces. This really seems like a reunion, especially since, as the Deputy Secretary spoke about earlier, we got to talk about this topic last week at FIU. And of course, with Bonnie Glick, who was my boss when she was Deputy Administrator at USAID. So just really pleased to be on this stage today. And it's a big topic. As the Deputy Secretary laid out, we are really facing unprecedented challenges right now in the world. We have a global pandemic that is 2+ years on. We have climate change. We have rising levels of hunger and food insecurity. And then we have democracy continuing to be under attack. Ms. Glick has on the Ukraine opinion, and that is so notable that we're sitting here today witnessing really one of the most perilous moments in European history, this unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine and the lives being lost and the drivers of insecurity and peoples that are crossing borders because of this. And then we have emerging technologies. I'm at that generation where I still remember when the first mobile phones came out, and it was less than 18 years ago. I remember being at the National Security Council in 2004 when the first cell phones, the official cell phones, were handed out, 2004. They were BlackBerries, if any of you remember that day. And now we're sitting here in 2022, and I think of the role of emerging technology, and it's almost overwhelming, right? And thinking, and we'll talk about that a little bit, how it's been used as such a force equalizer, right, for development outcomes. But how, when it's in the wrong hands, when it's in the hands of malign actors, the havoc that is wreaking globally, and how we address that. So really what we're here to talk about is how do we make sure our diplomatic ranks, our development programs, our foreign assistance is really ready and able to meet these 21st foreign policy and development challenges. This is the 21st century. Do we have the programs? Do we have the policies? Do we have the resources, which we'll talk about, and the workforce that are ready to meet those challenges? And I can't think of a better duo today to talk about it because, as Jan mentioned, this has been a bipartisan issue. This is something that we've talked about for the last decade plus. How do we do it? And concerted actions that have taken place under the leadership of the last several administrations to look at how we can do a better job. So with that, Deputy Secretary, I want to build on what you were explaining and just give you so much credit. It was already last October. The administration wasn't even a full year into the first term when you all announced State Department's 5-pillar plan for modernizing foreign assistance. And you gave us a little snapshot of that. But this is really a prescient model. And it's looking at the issue from, again, workforce to policies to tools to resources. And I want to dig in a little bit more and ask you, what is your goal? When you look at this 5-pillar plan, what is your goal and hope with regards to a modernized State Department? But I also want to ask you honestly, what are the chief obstacles you think you will face in trying to achieve those goals?
So you're referring to a speech Secretary Blinken gave at the Foreign Service Institute last October. I won't recite it all, but I commend it to you if you're interested in learning more about the 5 pillars. I think I could distill it to a couple of things without going through all the pillars. One is enabling the State Department to have the capacity and capability to deal with new challenges of this century that are not traditionally been part of the diplomatic toolkit. Cyber and emerging tech, global health security, climate change, and then some more traditional ones like economic statecraft and multilateralism. And so creating the new bureau and new special office, special envoy for emerging tech. We're doing a review now about how we should manage global health security in the future. We obviously have former Secretary Kerry as our special presidential envoy on climate, but we're trying to embed and institutionalize the climate work into the department, including creating additional climate positions in certain overseas posts and expanding our training on climate diplomacy. And we request in the 23 budget setting up a school within the Foreign Service Institute to focus on climate training. So in building both the institutional structure for these issues, but also the institutional capacity, either recruiting new people in who have these skills already, or training the workforce that we have to address these particular issues. And then the second broad thing we're focused on is revitalizing the workforce, which we were charged to do by President Biden, and reinvesting in it and building the workforce. When we came in to the administration, I came in March of 2021, but before that, when folks came in January, there are a fair number of vacancies in the civil service positions because of a hiring freeze that had been put in place by a previous secretary, and we're still building back from that. And then we have tried to add to the workforce both at state and USAID to address all the continuing challenges that we have. So in the 22 budget, we asked for nearly 500 new positions, roughly spread between the foreign and civil service. And we're doing the same, even a little bit more in the 23 budget. And we pretty much got most of the requests for 22. USAID also has ambitious hiring increases in its 2 budgets. So we're hearing the workforce saying, you're asking us to do more with the same number of people or fewer. And, that creates challenges, both morale and for retention and for getting the work done. So, we're trying to address that concern from the workforce. And more broadly, when we say an agile workforce, really trying to address the cultural issues of a big government bureaucracy and empower people and not manage it all from the 7th floor of the State Department. That's easier said than done. We're talking a good game. We're trying to deliver on it.
I have full faith that you can. I'm going to pick up on one of the pillars you talked about, which is looking at cyber and the new post you said that was created. And I'm going to go to Ms. Glick. This is an area, technology, innovation, you have long been involved with from your time at IBM to when you were a deputy administrator and USAID's launch of its first ever digital strategy, and really looking at what is the role of 5G and emerging technologies in development. And now you are at the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue, which is the nation's first tech tank, which I love. I wish I had come up with that. A tech tank where you are focusing on tech diplomacy. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about, in your experience, what has that nexus been between technology and U.S. foreign policy? And how are you seeing efforts in that space, innovation, technology? What role are they playing in modernizing foreign assistance?
Michelle, thank you. Very kind. Look, technology and development or technology and diplomacy are not words that are usually in the same sentences together. And yet, if technology and development are not talked about in the same sentences, they won't happen. What happens in developing countries if they're not on the same level or close to attaining the same level of technology access as people in developed countries? I think we can all figure out what that answer is. The answer is that the world remains split between those who have access to the cutting edge and those who don't. And at USAID, as part of becoming a modernized assistance agency and retaining its critical role as the largest bilateral aid provider of any country in the world, and America remaining the most generous country in the history of the world, technology and development have to be discussed in the same sentences. They have to be part of the conversation. So at USAID, when we launched our digital strategy, who knew how prescient it would be that we launched it in April 2020? Normally, something like that would be launched in an environment like this, in our home building, in the Reagan building, with a group of 100 people. But we were able to launch the digital strategy virtually to 4,000 people all over the world to talk about digital being a core component of what USAID has to do to remain relevant. Not only to remain relevant to our mission as the largest bilateral donor, but also to remain relevant in the context of the People's Republic of China, which was offering 5G access with all kinds of strings attached in developed and developing countries all over the world. So by virtue of COVID, we were able to launch virtually and get that message about technology and development being in the same sentences around the world. We talk at USAID when I was there, and I know it's continued to this day, about the concept of digital first. When aid mission directors and program managers and global health experts around the world are looking at ways to do their jobs most effectively, the idea now is to deploy a technology solution first. And if not first, at least as a component of all of USAID's programs around the world. How are we going to solve problems of food insecurity if we don't modernize supply chains? How are we going to solve problems of global health around the world if we don't continue to maintain the most complex supply chain on earth, that of the global health supply chain? That started with PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, continued through the President's Malaria Initiative, and continues to this day through everything that USAID is doing. It's a flagship that's so important for us to wave as a tech leader to provide technology around the world.
And to your point, I mean, how prescient that was at the time. And not knowing, right? And I think it just shows, again, how complex the landscape is right now with challenges. And if you think of COVID-19, it's not really a microcosm, right? It was, if you look at the first and second order impacts, right, it has hit every other development issue, foreign policy angle, and really brought to light enhanced issues. So on that note of global challenges, I want to go back to something you said, Deputy Secretary, about the resources. And to your point, President Biden has released the FY23 budget request, and it definitely represents a significant investment in America's global leadership. And, you know, I'd be the first to say I don't know that there would ever be enough funding to meet all of the global challenges we have today. But there are a lot. And I think one of the questions I would have for you is, knowing the challenges that are out there and knowing that the budget was about a 1% increase over FY22 levels, you know, how do you, in your role as Deputy Secretary, how do you advocate with Congress and work with Congress to, one, make sure the funding that's out there is flexible so that it can be used to meet these rising and complex challenges? And then I would add a question about COVID, the COVID supplemental that we saw passed last week. There was no funding for the global response. And I think for those of us in this room, we're all really touched by a global portfolio somehow. You know, that seems concerning. And so I would say at this time, you know, how would you address that? And I think some would argue that the needs are greater now than they ever have been in the fight against COVID. So, you know, Congressman Castro's not here, unfortunately, and so I'm going to put you on the spot and say, what would be your recipe for working with Congress on this?
So on the COVID supplemental, I don't think it's passed yet, but the leadership has locked it down, more or less, although they're having troubles getting a vote on it over another issue. The international component to this has been on again, off again, and over the course of the last several months, it was in there, it was not in there. So we're not giving up hope that there'll be another opportunity to address it. There's already talk of, I think, expectation there may be another supplemental for Ukraine and food security crises that are rising as a result of the war in Ukraine, given that Russia and Ukraine are big producers of wheat, that a lot of countries in the developing world, particularly Africa, depend on those wheat exports. So we're going to keep pushing on it, and I think USAID, which is working closely with the State Department, is doing the work to get shots in arms. And we have a sufficient number of donated vaccines out there. It's really the last mile of delivery and the infrastructure in countries to get people to have shots and be able to access the vaccine. And I believe we're probably going to run out of resources to continue to do that in the next couple of months. So we just have to communicate that reality to our colleagues in Congress, the need to continue to provide funding in this respect. And I think the support is there. They may ask us to find resources to offset the new funding, because that's what's happened on the domestic funding and the supplementals. So we're working on ideas on possibilities of that. On your other question on flexibility, when I came in and got briefings during the transition, the person who did the budget briefing for me and Secretary Blinken and a few other people showed the number of earmarks and sector directives from 8 or 9 years ago, and then showed it now, and it was the chart was like this. And I think it's over 90% now. Money is earmarked in one respect or another, sector, country directives, what have you. So we've tried to have we have had a conversation with the leadership of the appropriations committees, appealing for more flexibility. We have 2 new chairs in the House and Senate of the State and Foreign Ops subcommittees, Senator Coons and Congresswoman Lee, and they've been receptive to that. The 22 bill gave us a little bit more flexibility on the sector directives. And, it's just, we have to make plain and make people understand why the flexibility is important. The increase in the directives, to me, is reflection of a lack of trust between the 2 branches. So we've tried very hard to rebuild that trust with the Congress. Secretary's made it plain that working closely with Congress, being responsive to their requests for information and briefings and hearings is a core part of our responsibility. But we have to earn the trust. And so we want to communicate to them that we have some of these same priorities they do. We just don't want to be locked in to hard earmarks and directives that decrease our flexibility to respond to emerging requirements. And as all of you know who've worked in the federal government, we're now starting to put together the budget for fiscal year 24. And so people in the bureaus and here in the agency in this building trying to look ahead, and then we'll get this money in a year and a half, and then spending it another 6 months after that. So trying to forecast now what we're going to need in 2 years, we're just not that good at predicting the world. Nobody is. And so we need flexibility to adjust to the changing world.
Well, I have to say, Ms. Glick was nodding vigorously and then laughing. So I think she is feeling, she has felt your pain there.
There's a little relief that I don't have to deal with earmarks now.
But let's build on that. I mean, because also, the issues are vast, and it brings me into the next topic, which is, what is the role of the private sector? We have so many of USGLC's members here, so many from the private sector, and those who are joining us nationally as this is being broadcast to our nationwide membership. And I think all the time about the statistics we used to use at USAID, which is when USAID was formed in the early 1960s. Official direct assistance was really the primary external financial flows into the developing world, right? And it was a minority of that was private sector capital flows. Fast forward to today, and private sector flows into the developing world are at 90%, with ODA less than 10%. So a complete reversal, which again shows us when we're talking about modernizing our approach to foreign assistance, we also have to look at what is the role of the public sector, what is the role of the private sector. And so, Ms. Glick, you championed this when you were at at USAID with the launch of the new private sector engagement policy, which really looked at how do we harness the tools, the innovation, the resources of the private sector and create better public-private partnerships that meet both of our goals. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that, and how do you see those partnerships between the public sector, between private sector? How do you see them continuing to evolve to meet today's challenges?
So, Michelle, to be clear, the private sector engagement strategy at USAID was launched under your leadership. So thank you very much for that. And it was vital to the recognition of the role that the private sector plays, as you noted, with investment. She wants her child to grow up to be a consumer. So flipping that, the role of the giver as opposed to the role of the creator, is something that I believe is really important. The private sector creates jobs in America. Private sector creates jobs all over the world. And it's our incredible private sector that is so important for economic advances in emerging market countries. They've seen an opportunity to practice free markets and to see how free markets drive economic growth all over the world. And they've seen corporations, private businesses, small family businesses have seen that there are ways to grow people's lives through employment, through education, through reinvestment that are so important here at home as well as around the world. And so when we think about the private sector engagement that USAID fosters, it's through amazing programs that are enormously bipartisan, things like Prosper Africa, which is designed to not bring African small businesses to America to showcase in a single place to say, hey, look, we brought this from Africa. No, it's to bring American businesses to Africa to see that there are investment opportunities with great African businesses and to grow those businesses in a mutually beneficial way. Same with Latin America, same across the world. And that realization that this is an area where USAID can play an important role, along with economic and commercial and digital officers from the State Department, from the Commerce Department, this is all vital for growth around the world. So when you think about public-private partnerships, it's really along the lines of, hey, what can our private sector do to make our lives so much easier, to alleviate maybe some of those resource burdens on USAID and to just allow the free market to experiment. The thing that's cool about free market experiments is that when they fail, they shut down. And when you have long-standing programs that are not market-driven, but let's say state capitalism driven by China or by other malign countries that have different kinds of interests in emerging markets, you see unintended consequences. USAID has seen all over the world, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Djibouti or where have you, the end results of the Belt and Road Initiative of the People's Republic of China that haven't ended so well for those emerging market countries. The idea is to get ahead of that, and that's where I think USAID, as the pointy tip of the spear advocating for private sector engagement, has proved very valuable around the world.
Absolutely. Let me pause here, and I'd love to open up the floor to questions from the audience. My colleagues have microphones, and so if anyone would like to pose some questions. Okay, we've got one here. And if you wouldn't mind saying your name and who you're with.
Hi, I'm Chris Collins with Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And first of all, I wanted to thank you so much for the President agreeing to host Global Fund replenishment this year. That's wonderful, and for the great request for the Global Fund in the President's budget this year. How do you, the next step now is for the United States to really bring other donors on to match U.S. funding for the Global Fund in this critical replenishment year. How do we make the case to other donors around the world to be investing in fighting infectious diseases, even as there's a new war going on and there's all these strains and demands on international investment. How do we make the case to other donors on the Global Fund and other infectious disease investments that those have to be maintained?
Well, I honestly think the case is a little easier to make now in the middle of a global pandemic. If anyone didn't understand before the threat to global prosperity of the spread of infectious diseases before February of 2020, they understand it now. And through the work that our government has done in PEPFAR and the PMI in partnership with other countries and the Global Fund, it's not just that we've saved a lot of lives and people who had HIV, AIDS, but we've helped build a health infrastructure in a lot of countries that is now a platform for development and actually addressing the challenges of the pandemic. So in short, I think this is an area where it shows that the world doesn't organize itself, that in the absence of leadership from a country like the United States, that you don't have the continued and sustained global response to this kind of challenge. And in the vacuum where the United States is absent, then other countries are either doing nothing or they're making mischief. So we're going to lean in and really try to incentivize other countries to contribute to the Global Fund, and that's, it's a matching program essentially that our contribution is designed to spur other donors to come forward, and that's what we'll be working on for the conference.
Questions? Can one here?
Thanks so much. Kate Phillips-Brasso with Mercy Corps. Nowhere does technology, the private sector, and global trends collide more than in the climate change space. And arguably, this is one of the greatest global challenges amid the many others that we've discussed today that will impact all of us, particularly lower income countries and fragile places where we're already seeing it drive increased conflict, for example. But we just saw in the 22 budget, the Green Climate Fund get zeroed out. This was one of President Biden's major priority areas, and one where we actually understand there to be significant bipartisan support. So just wanted to get your perspective on this really key leadership initiative from this administration, how we can work to build bridges, again, recognizing there's private sector components here, there are security issues at play, economic issues, as well as humanitarian ones in this space, that this is not sort of a partisan issue related to the climate agenda, that this could be a real leadership area for the U.S. on a variety of fronts. Thank you.
So I don't know exactly what went down and why it wasn't funded in the 22 bill. The Appropriations Committee sometimes works in mysterious ways, but our sense was there wasn't sufficient bipartisan support for the Green Climate Fund, and there was opposition from some important members on the Republican side who I don't want to ascribe their motive. So it's the fact that it got zeroed out. We still are committed to a wide array of programs to address the climate crisis, including climate finance, both in state and the AID budget and other parts of the government. And we're going up the hill again to try to ask for money for the Green Climate Fund. So we actually do need your help to persuade some members that this is an investment worth making, because we've got to share the burden and particularly help countries that are less able to deal with the consequences of the climate crisis, to adapt and be more resilient. I mean, there's a lot of countries in the Pacific that they're staring this in the face right now, and need help from the developed world to address the challenges they face.
Okay. Secretary Glickman here.
Hi, Dan Glickman, affiliate with USGLC and other places, and thank you both for your amazing government service, both of you. So you both mentioned food security. Such a complicated and issue, and involves so many agencies of government, USDA, USAID, State Department, Pentagon, Treasury, and we have largely, not entirely, but we largely delegated the issue of feeding the hungry to the World Food Program, and we provide the largest piece of that. But this affects everything. It affects domestic inflation in politics. It affects world inflation in politics. And of course, it affects hungry people and starving people everywhere. And I guess I would ask, we're doing a good job, but I guess I would ask, do you think that we're organized in our government to deal with an issue as complicated as this one? I mean, every piece of government thinks that it owns a part of this action. And I would just ask you, are we able to look at this problem and deal with it effectively, engaging the private sector as well as the World Food Program, as well as the financial institutions of the world, to deal with the fact that we have almost 1 billion people that are suffering because of either food insecurity or famine?
Looks like he was looking at you.
All right. So we're going to solve this problem right here. So I have 2 states that now I have 3 with Purdue. Sorry, the Boilermakers got a little bit higher than the Fighting Irish, but neither of us made it. But I'm a Marylander, and I have a farm in Nebraska. So I have 2 competing forces going on here when it comes to food security in the big picture level. There's the Port of Baltimore, and there's the farmers in the Midwest. And this is so complex, and it goes exactly, Mr. Secretary, to your comment about how do we unstick some of the problems associated with food security and the delivery of food around the world. And it's bipartisan. There are people to shame on both sides for why we don't do it more efficiently. But the truth of the matter is there's a law on the books that requires us to ship foreign assistance around the world on American flag carriers. And this creates an incredible logjam, and it adds tremendous expense. The other thing that it does that I think our lobbyists don't, whether they recognize it or not, they won't acknowledge, is when you build capacity in a country, that's more long-term when it comes to food security than shipping grain from American farms on American flag carriers around the world. And so finding a way to unstick legislation that requires American flag carriers, and I think that there's been a lessening of that requirement over time. When I was first being in-briefed, it was an enormous percentage. If we can lower that and allow local production, local agriculture to thrive with an infusion of smart technology for smart agriculture to make better use of scarce water resources, we'll solve some of those problems. But more importantly, we'll create an environment that allows for the dignity of local farmers to be bringing food to the market. I'm going to give a very quick story. When I was in a refugee camp for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, the World Food Program, an incredible partner, had just begun a program where they were providing cash on debit cards, highly secured debit cards, that allowed women and men who were in the camp to go to local markets and not receive what was there provided by WFP, but to choose nutrition solutions for their families, buy food that was produced by local Bangladeshi farmers. It created markets for 1 million at the time. I'm sure now it's more refugees who were in dire straits. It provided funding for those farmers, market access to a large population, and dignity to the people who were living in really difficult refugee camp situations so that they could choose their own nutritional value for their family. These are the types of things that are the way forward, but we do have glue in our system that we have to find ways to unstick.
We've got time for 2 questions, so maybe what I will do is take 2 right back to back, and then we can address them here. Blue.
Thanks so much for the conversation. I'm Jenny Russell from Save the Children. And Deputy Secretary, you mentioned the Summit for Democracy, which I think has been a really important effort by the U.S. government to strengthen democracies around the world. But I have a question about what is the U.S. government going to do specifically in country through the U.S. Embassy to build trust between local government and local civil society? Because what I find is one of the biggest barriers is a lack of civic space in country and a lack of accountability of government to fulfill their commitments to democracy and anti-authoritarianism and anti-corruption. And I'm curious, what is the U.S. government in country through the U.S. Embassy going to do differently to build that civic space and build that trust? Thanks.
Thanks. And then we'll take the question across the aisle.
Thank you. Good morning. Danielle Kessler with the International Fund for Animal Welfare. So as we talk about, I want to go back to the COVID-19 response again, and we hear so much in that response about addressing the current pandemic and preparing for the next one, but much less about preventing the next one. And I think the best way to avoid the economic and human impacts is by preventing that from ever happening. We know that climate change is displacing communities, putting them into closer proximity in biodiversity hotspots where there are reservoirs of disease. And how do we go about preventing that next zoonotic spillover event? And how do we raise the prevention as part of the foreign policy conversation?
Great. Okay. So, Deputy Secretary, I'll start with you. And a really good question. I know you're both former Foreign Service officers. So,
no, not me.
Oh, excuse me.
I failed the Foreign Service exam.
I knew there was a background here. Well, the good thing we have Miss Glick here, who was a Foreign Service officer. And you can tell us about that at another time. But let's talk about the role of the embassies, because these really are America's, to your point, this is our representation in the country of the U.S. government. So how are we working to make sure we're building accountability and trust so that there is that room for civic space and there is that outreach to local institutions?
Well, in terms of our diplomats around the world in countries that have authoritarian governments, this is part of their charge to try to encourage the governments to open political space for dialogue and civic participation. It's easier said than done. There's a lot of countries that are just not really interested in this and nod when we say these things and then continue to throw people in jail and suppress dissent and not allow public discourse. So it's why the president pulled together the democracies to really try to re-energize the community of democracies, which is the name former Secretary Albright gave it 20 years ago, to both ask countries to think about how they can strengthen their own democracies internally, because obviously we have our own challenges with our democracy, but also how we can work with other countries and other governments and other political actors to promote the expansion of political space in authoritarian countries. So it's a long, hard slog. And I think for our diplomats, it is a central charge to engage with local communities, try to give them an audience, give them protective cover, meet with them to show that the United States thinks that they have a voice in that society, recognizing sometimes it's actually pretty dangerous work for those people who are coming to meet with American diplomats. And so the diplomats in the field have to make these hard judgments about when the moment is right for these kind of meetings, and at the same time pushing either publicly or privately the host government to open up more using tools or levers that we have. We've obviously not been perfect at this over the decades. We've sometimes talked a good game, but not always delivered, and every administration struggles with this, balancing relationships and security challenges with our democratic and human rights objectives. But the president's very committed to this. He talks about it a lot, as you may have noticed, so it is certainly something I think our diplomats understand is a key part of their mission.
Well, while you have the floor, let's go to the second question. And it's a question in everyone's minds. How do we prevent the next global pandemic? How do we use lessons learned? What are we doing now? And I'd be curious from the private sector angle, too, to make sure we're prepared or prevent this from happening again.
I'm hardly an expert in this space, so I'll say a few things, but hoping Bonnie knows more than I do to talk about it thoughtfully. My recollection is we actually had a program called Prevent in the Obama-Biden administration. I could have that wrong. Where part of it was we had CDC folks deployed forward, including in China, to help with early detection of possible outbreaks. And that was scaled back a little bit, and we had, I believe we had fewer people on the ground in China at the time of the outbreak in February 2020. But it's, in terms of the detection, it's building a network of surveillance capabilities, and we've done that through a number of mechanisms, but also PEPFAR has been part of that, building the health systems that create the expertise and the lab capacity to detect. But then to prevent, it's getting smarter about how these diseases start with outbreaks through animals, potentially, because obviously that's one of the potential sources of the outbreak in China, although I don't think that's ever been conclusively determined, and how we manage that kind of situation to literally prevent this from happening again. That's something we've obviously got to put front and center in our strategy.
I would just add to that this is where strategic deployment of technology really makes sense. So I hearken back to the early aughts when I was at IBM, and IBM developed a project at that time that they gave to the World Bank that was then part of USAID's network called FuseNet. It was the Famine Early Warning System network around the world. And at the time, it was like, oh, this makes total sense. You have sensors in place, and you can monitor weather patterns and all of this, and follow the famine and see where it's going next. And it made good logical sense. We talked about this with the outbreak of COVID. Why can't there, that was in the aughts, now we're in the 20s. Why can't there be some kind of pandemic early warning system that's put in place that engages with communities and community health workers all over the world? There are small-scale technology projects that have been deployed through USAID for monitoring in specific countries and in regions, but we haven't done it globally. So people will remember, of course, Ebola, isolated in certain parts of Africa, but we had some excellent monitoring capabilities for Ebola. Same with Zika, if you'll remember that, which hit a little bit closer to home in the Americas. It seems like a strategic deployment of technology could go a long way with sensors and community reporting to help us prevent the next global pandemic.
Couldn't agree. With that, we are at the end of our session. I would love to ask Jayon to come back up and close us out. And I want to add my own thank you so much to both of you. I hope I speak for everyone when I say you've certainly given me optimism. We've got a lot of challenges out there, but I feel really good knowing that we have both of you leading the public and private sector engagements on these things. So thank you.
And I echo those thanks. It was particularly great to hear such an emphasis on private sector engagement. That's certainly something that we do at Citi quite robustly. And thank you so much, Deputy Secretary McCune. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you so much, Michelle. Let's give the panelists a round of applause. Look forward to continuing the conversation.